Okay, it is 12:10. You're welcome to turn on your screens and join me. You're also welcome to keep your screen off if you're slurping on some soup or otherwise enjoying some lunch. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see you here today. As a reminder, for those of you who don't know me, you can see on my little name placard, I'm Erika Offerdahl, and I'm a professor in the School of Molecular Biosciences. Um, I'm a professor of biochemistry, but a lot of my scholarship and research is on teaching and learning. And today I wanted to just spend some time talking about evaluating teaching because it's such an important part of our professional careers. And just, kick around some ideas for how you might make the most out of your student evaluations and how they can contribute to the larger picture that you're painting in your materials that you put together for promotion and for tenure. So that's where we'll start. I know that it's awkward having this over the lunch hour because people are eating and maybe aren't feeling like they want to contribute, but please do unmute and interrupt at any point if you have questions. I don't mind. I won't be able to see hand raising as well. But so I invite you to interrupt where I'm hoping to be a little bit more casual with you all. Okay, so when I think about our student evaluations, I think about it as just one small piece of the picture, right? That really, when I'm trying to make a case for what I do as a faculty member in the classroom, there's multiple pieces of evidence that I can draw on to talk to my peers about my effectiveness as a teacher. And nationally, we're seeing Centers for Teaching and Learning talk about teaching evaluation in terms of three different voices that we can call on when we're evaluating what we do in the classroom. The first one that I think we're very familiar with is the peer voice. And that often takes the form of an invitation to a colleague who you would ask to come into your classroom, observe your teaching, provide some feedback. There are also other ways to do this. I particularly like to invite faculty who teach one section of a multi-section course to bring like your instructional materials to a team meeting and invite peer reflection and peer voice on the things that you're doing in the classroom that way. That's certainly a way that we can improve our teaching, or we can be acknowledged for the things that we're doing in our classroom that are evidence-based and effective. Then, of course, we have student voice, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And there are many different ways that we can collect student voice or invite student voice into our reflections on teaching practice. We are required to give our students the opportunity at the end of the semester to provide their voice. But I'm hoping that by the end of this session, I can convince you that there are other ways that you might, and in a different cadence that you might invite student voice in your teaching. And then a piece that perhaps we don't leverage enough is the self-voice. What I mean by self-voice is the part of us as scholarly teachers or scientific teachers, it's where we really ask ourselves, are we effective as instructors? What evidence am I drawing on to convince myself that I'm doing a good job? And how can I improve? And where can I learn some skills for that improvement? And how can I document my growth as a professional in the classroom? And so that self-voice is really a reflection on our craft as an instructor and our journey as we continue to improve. So some would argue that really robust evaluation of teaching requires all three voices, and that if we do a good job of leveraging those voices, we should be able to have access to meaningful and trustworthy data that we can use to recognize teaching effectiveness. We can use it to identify areas for improvement, and we can really use it to celebrate what we're doing in the classroom. And if we really have a robust procedure for gathering these data, will also have the indirect impact of reducing implicit bias in the information that we're getting, and also really applying a fair procedure across all faculty, independent of what it is they're teaching and in what environment. So today we're talking about student voice. And I know you've probably got some thoughts about student voice, because why wouldn't we have thoughts? For faculty, we have lots of thoughts about things. So what I'd like to ask you first is, if I say to you, I think that having student voice in your teaching evaluation procedures is critical, what concerns does that raise for you? So I would like to invite you to type into the chat common concerns that either you have or you've heard your colleagues mention when we talk about student voice. So I'll just give you a second to reflect on that and type it into the chat. I see Melinda. Thanks, Melinda. Hi, it's good to see you. Yeah, I'm seeing student bias. And Cliff added on to that to say, yeah, when we have student evaluations, we're probably only hearing about those students who are either really happy with us or really unhappy with us, and we're not hearing about the middle. We can get conflicting information from our students, right? I loved that lecture on metabolism. I hated how she lectured on metabolism, right? You're getting two conflicting ideas. Concerns that student evaluations can lead to grade inflation or like less rigorous teaching in the classroom. I love what Teddy has in here. Teddy, you wrote, one interaction can set the tone for how the student perceives the course. The reason I like your response is because you're really pointing out that student evaluations are their perception of what is happening in the class. They are not a measure of student learning, right? The way we measure student learning is through our assessments, but it's really their perception of what's happening in the learning environment. And so we have to keep in mind when we're looking at these data and interpreting these data that it is student perception. And that's not to say that it's not valued, because it absolutely is. How our students are perceiving the learning environment is directly tied to things like intrinsic motivation, their persistence, their resilience. So we do care about how they're perceiving our environments, but it's just one small piece of what we're doing as teachers. Yeah, and Martina says this too, like the evaluations are about how they're feeling and perceiving the situation, but it's not necessarily about student learning. And that's okay, because we have other ways to get at student learning. Okay. I hear you. These are concerns that I've had as a junior faculty member and a faculty member throughout my career. But I will say that I've learned a few tips that have made me a little less concerned about some of these things that you brought up. In particular, I'm going to today talk to you about some strategies that I have seen in my own student evaluations to reduce bias. So we'll talk about those first. So if the idea here, right, we're taking another step back, our idea here is that we want to have very robust teaching evaluation procedures. We have these three voices. If we are going to leverage the student voice, we want to make sure that we are getting good data, right? That's the very simplest way to think about it. If we're going to have student voice, we need good data. What do I mean by good data? Well, the first thing is I want to make sure that I have a representative picture of the majority of my students. So one thing I've heard a lot from my colleagues here at Washington State is I can't even get students to fill out the evaluations anymore now that they are electronic and administered via Blue. my response rates have plummeted. And so now when I look at those student data, I'm even more concerned that I'm only hearing from the most vociferous, either those that really loved me or really hated me. And I'm not getting any meaningful information from, the majority of those middle students. And so I would invite people to think that there are some concrete things you can do to increase response rates. And there's no one size fits all. So I'm going to give you several ideas, and I just invite you to think about those that fit with your teaching philosophy and your personality. Okay. But the easiest thing we can do is just communicate more with our students about the student evaluations in general. Okay, so if you Google yourself, Blue evaluations, WSU, it'll take you to the confluence that tells you everything that we know from like kind of a university level about how Blue evaluations are administered and used. And in that, you'll read that Blue evaluations are available until the very end, like the last day of finals week. And they actually get sent out to your students, unless your department dictates a different timeline. But by and large, the timeline is students will get the first email indicating that their evaluation is available about 3 weeks before the end of the semester. Okay, and it comes in an email to their WSU email. All right, now we know that our students are not always great at checking their email. I'm not always great at checking my email. So what you'll want to do is communicate early and often to your students that the evaluations are coming, where they're going to hear about the evaluations, and how they can access them. And so you're going to be encouraging them to go to their email. You might even be putting announcements into Canvas. You certainly should be announcing this during class so that they know that it's coming up. And then you're considering good practice is reminding them. And what they say for like a 3-week survey turnaround time, messaging should happen every 3 or 4 days. Okay. Yeah, Mark, your hand was up. What's up, Mark?
Perfect. The announcements go out to the students, but we used to get a copy of that announcement, and that hasn't happened the past year or so, maybe two. And I mean, that helps in being able to reinforce the same message.
Yeah, it does. And I'm glad you raised that, Mark, because I noticed that too. When I was first here at WSU, I knew exactly when that was going out to students. And now I feel like, it's finals week. And I'm like, did they even get a message about student evaluations? So I reached out to uh, my department person who's in charge of Blue, and I asked them like what gives. And it's a setting has changed, but what I have done for the person that does Blue for our department is I ask them to remind me that that has come out and afford me the information they have. But I've also just set an automatic timer on my calendar. Now that I know that it comes out 3 weeks before the end of the semester, I just put a calendar reminder for myself to remind my students that Blue is going to be out there. Yep. So you can figure out your own cadence for how you want to communicate with students. I think a combination of verbal and email is really great. But you want to tell them that you want them to fill it out. And just by reminding them sends a clear message that you value their feedback. And the more they feel that you value their feedback, the more likely they are to give it to you. Then when you're first describing to your students, you want to talk about how you're going to use the responses. And I would actually invite you to consider talking about the role of student evaluations in your teaching well before the end of the semester. I often, when I introduce a new activity or introduce the way that my course is set up, I will indicate to my students that some of the things I'm doing are based on feedback from prior years. So I make it really clear that I am revising my teaching every year based on feedback. And so if those students are hearing that throughout the semester, then again, they're going to think that I value their feedback, I listen to it, and I might be able to change something in response to it. What I've learned recently, and I think it was Cliff that may have told me this, but I heard recently from sort of the student affairs side of um, the university that our students actually aren't convinced that these are confidential. So,
You did hear that from me.
I was from Cliff. Okay, I'm glad I remembered something smart. Yay, thanks, Cliff. So, like, our students get this thing in the mail that says, please tell us about your course, and they get it sent to their email. So it kind of makes sense that they might think that if they click on the link and then fill it out, that you would know that Erika Offerdahl said X, Y, or Z about your class. And in all reality, what do we see on the other side? We can see who has completed it, but we don't get their responses until after the course is over. So it's really important to explain that to your students. Yes, you're getting this request directly to your email. When you respond, I will only know that you completed it, and I'm going to celebrate that you completed it, but I will not know what you said ever because I won't even get all those responses until the very end. So I couldn't even deduce it by figuring out that Erika filled it out on Wednesday and, oh, I saw one more response on Wednesday, so it must be Erika's, right? We get them in the aggregate at the very end. The other piece that I think is very important is incentivizing their participation. And there are a ton of different ways you can do this, okay? You can acknowledge to your students, like, as you're seeing people filling them out, you can begin each class period and congratulate your students on taking your invitation seriously. That's just a no-cost verbal way of doing it. I've heard of other faculty who tie different incentives to it. So they might say, if I get 60% participation from the class, I'll give 2 bonus points on the final exam. And if I get 80% participation, I'll give 3 bonus points. Okay. I do it a little bit differently in my course. I just, I bake it into how I assign their grade. I tell them that 2 points of, the bazillion points that are available in my class are, it's an assignment. They need to log on and do the student evaluations. So I get 98, 99% response rate, sometimes 100. Those points don't matter, but by putting it on my syllabus, I'm communicating to them from the very beginning of the class that this is an important thing for me and that I take it seriously and I want to hear stuff. So
Can I just mention something about that?
yeah,
I've always been tempted to do that, but I thought it's probably not allowed because it's not actually tied to the course, student learning outcomes, etc. So I went, So I've always offered a bit as extra credit points.
yeah, I mean, I I require things in my mind. Part of my learning outcome for students is making sure that I'm meeting the learner where it is. And if I don't know that information, I'm not going to be as effective of a teacher. So that's where I've rationalized doing it and in a very small amount. But you can do it the flip side. Like you said, you can do extra credit. I don't think if you do it, you might not get as high. That's okay. You still will get higher than if you were to just leave it up to them.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And if you couple that with the extra credit, with giving them time to do it in class. We used to, when they were pen and paper, right? We would have time in class, we would leave the room, they would fill them out, someone would collect them and turn them into the administrative office. If you give time to your students, the research would tell us that it's important. You will be less likely to evoke implicit bias if you give if you give sufficient time. So what I mean is, if you give it at the end of class and you give it during the last 5 minutes of class, Students will either just get up and go to their next class because they want to get coffee at the coffee cart on their way there, or they will rush through it. And we know from the research on implicit bias that the more we put a time constraint on things, the more likely we are to evoke people's implicit biases. And that has particularly negative effects for, and these are documented in the literature, particularly negative effects for folks who are for effects by gender and race, ethnicity, and accent, actually. Marian, I see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Could you just clarify for me with the credit? You're not actually asking them to verify that they did the evaluation themselves, like give you some kind of proof, or what are you, how are you doing that?
Oh, yeah. I can log on to Blue anytime after it's been released to my students, and it will tell me, it'll have like my whole student roster, and it'll just say complete or not next to it.
Oh, so you actually can know by student if they completed it. I didn't
Yeah.
realize that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's magic. It's magic. So I just go, yep, you did it, you did it, you did it, you did it, you did it. Yep. Yeah. I don't give class time because I make it an assignment for them and they just do it on their own time. If I give class time to it, though, I would give it at the beginning of the class. I would give maybe 15 minutes. I would do it on a day when I think attendance is going to be high. And I would leave the room and I would let them know that I'm leaving the room for 15 minutes and then I'll be back. And again, at that moment, I would assure them that these are going to be anonymous, but I'm giving them time because I think it's so important. And the other piece is just make sure they're getting it. So I have a lot of students who are like, I didn't even see it in my email and now they're closed and it's too late. So it's a simple little thing, but I was surprised when I first got here how many students that was happening for. All right, so let's say you do some of these things and you get higher response rates and you're like, yes, super excited. I have my students are taking it seriously. You might still be thinking like, I don't know, like, I don't trust that students are really like giving me unbiased information, right? They might have an axe to grind with me or something else. So there are some ways that we can reduce bias, and these are based on research. I alluded to one already, and that is that all humans have unconscious bias, and we are more likely to activate these biases when we're tired, when time is pressed, when we're under stress, and also when the criteria for evaluation are not clear. Okay. So if this just goes back to if you give class time, don't do it at the end of class and do give plenty of time for them so that you're reducing the likelihood that those unconscious biases are activated. You can also think about coaching your students on how to respond. Right? I view the student evaluations as a partnership between me and my students so that they can feel comfortable telling me how to get better. And so I tell them that. And I say, if you give me, I'm certainly going to look at the numbers, that's fine. But what's more important to me are the qualitative comments with specifics. I want you to give me specific feedback that is actionable. So I'll give them the example like this. You can tell me that you loved class discussions. That makes me feel good, right? Like I love those positive comments on my evaluations, but it doesn't tell me how, like much specific information about why those discussions were awesome or how they were helpful to the students. And so I give this example to my students and I say, give me something more specific. So for example, you might say, when we were doing this discussion, it was really hard. It's sometimes hard for me to take notes because I'm so engaged in the discussion. It really helped me when you jotted down the main points of the discussion so that we could reflect on them later. That's something really actionable that I can do for them if they think it's useful for their learning. And and there's some research that suggests it is too. Similarly, I can say to them, this is I have readings in my class. I've had lots of comments like this. The readings were redundant. And I'm like, what do I do with that? What does that even mean? How can I communicate with my students? A different way for those students to give that same feedback would be, oh, we had a lot of articles that were on the same topic. I didn't understand why. That signals to me that I need to do a better job of helping my students understand what I assign in my course and why and how it supports their learning, right? So perhaps the reason I had different articles on the same topic was because I was trying to get them to see different styles of writing, and they missed that because they were, you know, hyper focused on the topic and not on what my actual learning outcomes were for assigning those readings. And the other piece is in coaching, I actually will tell them what I am really interested in for my own growth. So I'll give you an example here. These are the canned questions that the College of Veterinary Medicine uses. And I have said to students in the past, like, oh, last year I heard from students that my materials and learning aids were not very organized. And so this semester I've really worked hard on it. I would really appreciate specific comments about that item. So I'll show them the items and invite feedback on the things that I've been working on. I will also look at these questions and ask myself, how are my students going to interpret these items? And is there an opportunity that they might interpret them in a way that is not the way they were intended? So when I look at these particular prompts, the one that sticks out to me, oh, you didn't. Oh, done. There it is. The one that sticks out to me here is the instructor was fair. What does that even mean? I think a student can interpret that in a lot of different ways. So I'll pull this one out for students and I'll say, this is how I would like you to think about fair. I will say something along the lines of, for fair, what this means to me is that I clearly communicated to you how your grade was going to be earned in this class, and I applied those criteria consistently. That's a much different and more concrete thing that a student can evaluate me on, because they can tell me, you know, I didn't know how you were going to assign grades on that final project. That was really obtuse. And when I looked at the rubric, I saw, you know, on the final criterion, it was a little bit muddy. I didn't see how that was going to translate to a score. And that's something I can change. And allows me to refine what I'm doing each year. So don't be scared to ask specifically for feedback on what you've been working on. Don't be scared to coach students, because this is a partnership and you're wanting to hear how to make the learning environment better for them. Okay. So you've got lots of data. Now what? Let's say you were really successful at getting the response rates you want. You've done some things that have reduced the bias that's in them. These are mine from a few years ago. And I was super happy because I had 54 students in the class and I had 54 students complete it. But now what, right? We've got all these numbers and we've got all of this qualitative information that comes along. What do I do with this as a faculty member? So there's a couple things here, right? One is that we do have to report these data. We do need to share these data. We're invited to share these data for annual review. That's one thing that we're doing with our data. But the other thing that I invite you to use your data for are, like I said, reflection and self-improvement. So how do I do that? Well, let's start with the quantitative data. What I see most common when I'm reviewing portfolios, not just for WSU, though I do a lot of that, but also for other universities, is I see folks literally like cut and paste this out, and that's what they stick in their portfolio. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I don't think it gives the full picture of what an instructor is doing. There's also a couple things here, right? Like you might be looking at my median and being like, in my department, that seems kind of low because our scale is a 1 to 5. Well, in CVM, we do a 1 to 4 scale. So if you were just interpreting my numbers based on the numbers in your department, it wouldn't translate really well. Instead, I invite people to think about what is the distribution of your responses, because they can give you a little bit more information about what's happening. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Let's say we took these sorts of distributions and we just put them side by side. So let's imagine I'm an instructor, I'm teaching 4 different courses, and this is the students, this is just for this item. Like I was prepared and organized for lectures and activities. And I can see that for my first course, my second course, my third course, and my fourth course, this is the distribution of how students responded for excellent, good, fair, poor, or very poor. Now, these aren't really my data, gang, because I just told you that I have mine, and CBM is on a scale of 4 and this is a scale of 5, but let's just pretend this is me and these are my 4 courses. Let me ask you this. Which course am I a better instructor in? Based on these data, and you can unmute or you can put it in the chat. Which course am I a better instructor in? Okay, Martina says D. Mark says B. Cameron
A or
says
C?
B or C. Okay.
A or C?
Oh, A or C. Okay. B is a good sign. Does anybody want to volunteer? Like, I'm hearing a lot of B's, maybe some C's. Can you get any brave souls want to tell me why those look good? What are you looking at in these?
I'll go.
Thanks, Katie.
Hi. And by the way, I was iPhone 52 on my walk home, if you were wondering who that iPhone was. Well, the prompt was, which am I a better instructor in? And you can't tell based on this one question, because it's about preparing organized for lectures and activities, but there's so much more to the instruction.
Yes.
But I think B, with 90% of students saying excellent or good, so it's a favorable and also fair. You also demonstrated the how vague that word is. That feels like a good sign. When I first saw it, I thought that's a lot of orange, that's concerning, but maybe that's how I was reading it. But when I say, oh no, that's good, that I think is a very good sign. That only 5% of students say poor or very poor. I also don't know the size of these classes, the different details. I'd be curious to know.
No, and let's say, right, like this is one item. This is, I guess I should have phrased it like, how good am I doing at preparing and organizing for lectures? And in which one of these am I doing better? And for some of you, you might teach multiple sections of the same course, and looking at the distribution here might make you pause and say, like, why is it so much different for section D as opposed to section A? But maybe this is, if you're a new teacher and you teach multiple sections, there are days when you're scrambling. It's a reality. But if I will know that for myself personally, when that happened, it was like the first time I taught it that week, I was scrambling. But by the fourth time I taught it that day or that week, I was looking more like this right here, right? So I might not be alarmed by this. It's just showing that I have a new prep and it's taken me a few times. And, by the time I show up on Wednesday, I'm much more organized than I was on Monday. Maybe that's it. Another thing that I would point out here is that if I were to have reported these data just using the mean, like the central tendency, they all have the same mean of 4. So this to me, is evidence that perhaps I do want to look at the distribution And as an instructor, I want to try and figure out why this is happening for me. So if this is truly a different course, why are 20% of my students really feeling that things I wasn't prepared and organized, and how much truth is in that? Is it a new prep? Maybe I'm not as concerned about that with a new prep, but if this is something I've been teaching for 5 years, maybe that's something I want to pay attention to. I had some people say that D was the best one, and I'm wondering, that could be because it has the highest percentages of excellent, right? Like 70% said I was knocking it out of the ballpark. There are some units for which they might really only pay attention to the excellent because, maybe they have in the criteria for evaluation excellence in teaching. And so we're only going to look at the excellence. And maybe that's the criteria, right? But I think that for me personally, looking at these, I look at patterns. I try and ask myself if there's any reason why I might be seeing this pattern, and whether or not it's of concern at that point. I want to say it at this point as well. These are not how we should be comparing instructors with one another. These comparisons shouldn't be, this is Erika and this is Cliff and this is Katie and this is Gordon. These data we should use to measure ourselves against ourselves. How are we doing each semester? How are we improving? What are we doing? And how are we responsive to these data? This is also an opportunity to intersect those student data with your self data. And so I'll give you another example here. Let's say I'm teaching the same course every fall semester. And let's say that this is the distribution I get in fall 2021. And maybe this was only the second time I taught it. And so I would, maybe this is evidence for myself where I say, I am really going to focus on my preparation and organization. In fact, I'm going to spend some extra time, in the spring semester, just working on preparing for next fall. Now I can put that in my annual review document, that is a personal goal of my own. And then I can track what I'm doing over time. Like, am I moving the needle in how my students are perceiving my preparation and organization? I may even use this to get some information from my students the subsequent semester, and I might do it earlier. Like, I don't have to wait until the very end of the semester to ask for feedback from my students. So if this is something I'm working on, I can, like in week 4, give an anonymous survey to my students and ask them, how prepared and organized am I? And how can I, what's happening here? And I can make real-time adjustments. Okay. So a few takeaways about your quantitative data, I invite you to look at your distributions and not just the central measures of central tendency. I'd have real clarity about what the scale is. Quite honestly, when I first came to WSU, I didn't even notice that my scale was on 1 to 4. And I did look at the central tendency, and in my prior institution, it was on a scale from 1 to 5. And I was like, why am I getting such low scores? They actually weren't that low when you consider that it's 1 to 4, not 1 to 5. I also like to interpret it based on what is being valued. So of those different items on the student evaluations, there are going to be some that I value more than others as a teacher. And so maybe those are the ones I'm going to focus on first. And I use it as an opportunity to target my own self-reflection on my practice and to make clear to myself and to my colleagues what action I'm taking to improve, right? Okay, so what do we do with all those qualitative comments? If you're getting high responses, this becomes the intimidating piece, because you're reading through and you're gonna, like you said earlier, you're gonna have some students who liked it, some students who didn't like it, and it becomes a like, what do I do with it? It's kind of a feedback soup. So I'm just going to give some advice that I found in the literature. And really, the important piece about these qualitative data is that we have to do due diligence and making sure that we are reporting them accurately and we're reflecting on them accurately. Meaning we shouldn't just be cherry picking and pulling out the best comments, nor should we be focusing on the one or two really negative ones. Okay. That's a really great way to beat yourself up and feel bad about your teaching when really you're working hard, you're working on improving, and you're really committed to your craft. So what I'm inviting here is a more systematic way to go through those comments. And the first question is for the comments that you're looking at, you can ask yourself, is it related to teaching and learning? Really simple question. So for example, you might get comments like this. I teach in Spark, and I'm in one of those classrooms that has computers. And there was one semester where like the computers were always broken. Like our computer didn't work all the time. 8 a.m. is too early. I really appreciate biochemistry now. I like that third one. That makes me feel good, but it's not really about teaching and learning, right? And so for those comments, you can read them, but you can set them aside because they don't directly help you assess what you're doing in the classroom, nor how well you're doing it, so that you can think about how you might refine your teaching. So it's okay to just sort of put those aside for a second. The next thing you want to ask yourself is, are they specific? Remember when I said we want to coach our students on the type of feedback they can give us? This is off of my, bye Teddy. This is off of my own student evaluations. Like, what's one thing that you would change for next, that you would tell this instructor to change? Study guides. Like, does that mean make them better? Does that mean make them shorter? What does that mean? It's not specific. So again, that's one that I would set aside. I'm not going to forget about it, but I'm just going to set it aside, as opposed to something that is more specific. Like, I would appreciate it if all the learning outcomes could be in a single document so we could use it as a study guide. Okay. So this comment here is not only specific, it's also actionable. Those are the types of comments that I can do something with. I can refine my teaching. I can feed back to my students and tell them what I'm doing. And so what I do is I'll very quickly use this kind of flow chart to focus my attention on those comments that are related to teaching and learning, that are specific, that are actionable. So like of those 54 that I had, maybe 20 fit this criteria, even after me coaching them. And then I can aggregate them by theme. So for this one, right, this is about study materials or materials that I'm giving students. This one is just about my availability outside of class, right? So this kind of feedback is much better than the Likert item that says my instructor is available outside of class. If they had all put, or a majority of them had said no, I wouldn't know why. I'd be like, yes, I am. I have office hours all the time. This tells me, oh, I might have office hours, but I picked the wrong time for them. Okay. Easy changes I can make on that. Now, what do I do with these other ones that I told you to set aside for a second? I do invite you to pay attention to them because they do tell us information about things that are impacting our student experience. Some of those things we won't have control over, but we can still act on them. So because they're really telling us about pain points that somehow influence the student experience. And, if we can help make that student experience better, it's good for them, for their whole, the whole student holistically. So for example, that comment, our computer didn't work all the time. I can take all of those comments and I did. I actually came and talked to John Manwaring in the Spark and I said, John, this was really a problem. See, like is what can we do about this? Are there any monies that can help us do this? Or, and so it allowed me to have a conversation about the things that were impacting my students, but that were outside of my control. 8 a.m. is too early for a class. Maybe I bring that up with the curriculum committee. That's probably not something I would work on changing, but maybe it is. And maybe I don't like teaching at 8 a.m. But these are things that you can look at pain points. You can even just acknowledge them with your students and say, I know nobody likes an 8 a.m. calculus class. But we have to have it at 8 a.m. because we don't have any other options for classrooms. We don't have any other options because of how the curriculum is set up. Sorry, that's out of my control, but I hear you. I hear it's a pain point. And then we're almost out of time. The other piece I have here for you is all those positive comments that you read, even if they're not directly related to teaching, even if they're not specific, even if they're not actionable, cut and paste them out of those PDFs. Make one giant PDF, save it entitled Smile File, print it off, and display it prominently. So on those days when you are feeling like you're working so hard and nobody notices, you'll have it there, because what you do in the classroom matters. Your students see it, and it's so easy to forget about the really wonderful work you're doing. So do yourself a favor, put it up there and celebrate yourself. Okay. Final thoughts, and I'll get you out of here. Don't feel limited to doing only end of semester evaluations. Okay. So I've had folks come to me and say, all my students use end of semester evaluations to do is to rip me apart. They only have negative things to say. And I've said to them, well, why, in instances where perhaps you yourself have had negative feedback to give to someone, why did why do humans choose to give feedback in a particular way? And some of it is where we just feel powerless, or we feel like we're not being listened to. You can always ask for feedback from your students much earlier in the semester, so that if there are pain points, you can respond to them in real time. So I give anonymous evaluations to my students. I say, what's one thing that's going well? What's one thing that isn't going so well? What's one thing I can do to help you? And what's one thing you can do to help to support your own learning? And then I take those and I spend 15 minutes in class saying, okay, I didn't realize that my online quiz was, opening late. I can fix that. In terms of the readings, I'm not going to fix that because they're important for your learning, right? So you can really say to them, I heard you. Here's one thing I'm going to do to make the classroom, to tailor it for what you're needing. And here's the things that are non-negotiable. We're going to do them anyway. So collect that feedback early, respond to it, and be clear about what you can change and what you can't and why. And what you'll find is that providing that opportunity for students to give you feedback early means that what they give you at the end of the semester tends to be more tempered, more actionable, more kind, and more reflective. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I think I went almost a little long. I didn't leave as much time for questions as I'd want. And I'm going to stop recording because nobody wants to have their question recorded forever. So let me do that.